I wasn't in a good place that late winter, and that's a clean way of saying I had turned into a man who could keep ledgers straight, but couldn't look his own life in the eye. I was 48, old enough to know better than sulking, young enough to still wear it like armor. My wife had been gone 11 months. My father's homestead had been sitting half-kept and half-forgotten since his stroke the year before that. My son, Caleb, and I had managed 2 years of stiff, careful silence that felt polite on the surface and rotten underneath. I told folks in town I was back on the property to settle things, sell the last of the herd, sell barn timber while it still had any value, close the books, move on. That was the practical framework, and practical was all I trusted. Most mornings started the same way, with me standing in my father's kitchen in boots that left mud flakes on cracked linoleum, reheating yesterday's coffee because making a fresh pot felt like too much commitment for a man planning to leave. The microwave rattled like it had loose teeth. The window above the sink looked over the west lot where fence posts leaned like tired men. On the table sat unpaid bills in a neat stack, feed receipts clipped with a rusted binder ring, and my phone face up beside a cold biscuit I never touched. That morning, there was a draft text from Caleb still open from the night before, half-typed and never sent. You don't have to answer right away. I just wanted to say I'm out at... I had stopped there, thumb hovering. Pride has a way of calling itself caution. Grief has a way of backing it up. The coffee beeped. I drank it anyway. Burnt and bitter, with that scorched edge from being reheated twice. I stood there long enough to watch the steam thin out and disappear. The work itself was plain and non-trivial, which was maybe why I kept doing it. Feed the 3 cows that were left of my father's line. Break the skim ice in troughs if the sun hadn't reached them. Check the coop latch. Carry split oak from the lean-to to the stove. Patch whatever weather had unstitched overnight. I had one old dog, Blue, a cattle dog mix with one torn ear, and the patience of a pastor. He trailed me from barn to pump to woodpile, never asking questions, never demanding I be cheerful, just making sure I kept moving. Some days I figured he was the only thing keeping the place from going fully quiet. By the second week of March, the storm pattern had settled in hard, and everybody within 20 miles called it the Widowmaker Freeze. Sleet and hard wind, then a daytime thaw that turned every lane to axle-deep mud, then a fast drop at dusk that locked ruts into black ice. It had already burst one waterline by the back wash basin. I found 2 hens stiff in the coop after a night I thought I'd prepared for. I carried them out wrapped in feed sacks because even small losses deserve some dignity. Every evening, I counted cows twice before bed, like I could keep winter from taking inventory. That particular morning, the wind had gone absent in a way that made my shoulders tighten. No crows on the fence, no jay chatter in the cottonwoods, not even that fussy rustle of dry grass against the lower wire. Just the sound of my own boots in thawed mud and Blue's tags ticking soft every few steps. Silence in the country is usually full of little things. This was blank. I remember thinking the whole place felt like it was listening. I had just set a bale hook down by the barn when I saw the marks on the door. At first glance I thought mud had splashed up from tires, except no one had driven there, and the pattern was wrong. 5-fingered spreads, one beside another, smudged and rimmed in drying clay, each print broader than my hand and set at heights that made no sense. One sat about at my shoulder, another was near the top crossbeam, high enough I would have needed a step ladder and a good stretch to fake it. The spacing said hands, not tools. The shape said palm and finger pads, not gloves. I stood still with the feed bucket in my left hand and felt something in me shift from tired to fully awake. Blue walked up beside me, sniffed the lower print once, then sat. No raised hackles, no bark, no warning growl. He thumped his tail a single time and looked past the barn toward the tree line like he was acknowledging somebody standing polite at a distance. I set the bucket down, put my palm against the nearest mark, and stared at the difference long enough for my hand to start shaking. Mine looked like a child's tracing against it. I heard myself mutter, "Well, Hank, you've officially started taking farm advice from a mystery giant," and then laughed once, short and dry, because the alternative was admitting I felt close to tears over a muddy handprint on old cedar boards. I walked the perimeter after that with the determination of a man trying to solve a spreadsheet error. I checked the gates, all latched, no chain cut, no hinge damage. I scanned the back lane for truck tread, nothing but my own tracks from yesterday and one set of deer slots near the creek bend. I looked for boot prints around the barn apron and found only churned Thor mud, chicken tracks, and Blue's rounded paw marks. I even stepped off distances in my head, trying to force scale into something manageable. Maybe I had judged the height wrong. Maybe the door had warped and moved marks upward. Maybe some prankster with carved paddles had come through for laughs. Each theory felt thin as paper the second I touched it. I told myself this couldn't be real in the way people mean real, measurable, ordinary. I told myself grief had a way of making symbols out of anything. I told myself lack of sleep and too much coffee could turn a branch shadow into a person and a mud blotch into intention. But the prints were there, clear as ledger ink, and they carried a detail my mind wouldn't let go of. The pressure varied across each finger, as if whatever made them had placed a hand carefully, not slapped it down. Deliberate, not frantic, not cruel, like somebody checking the door for strength. Blue rose and moved a few steps toward the cottonwoods, then sat again. Same posture, calm, waiting. If you'd asked me then what unsettled me most, it wasn't the size. It was that my dog acted like we had a visitor and manners mattered. I went on with chores because chores don't care what you've seen. I forked hay, filled buckets, scooped feed, rechecked the far hinge on the calf pen where Frost liked to seize the pin. By noon, Thor water had started to run in narrow brown lines under the fence, and my gloves were wet through at the fingertips. I carried an armload of split wood from the pile and noticed a sheet of corrugated tin propped at an angle where I hadn't left it. Under it sat a neat stack of dry kindling, narrow cedar and pine strips laid crisscross so air could move between them. Dry, after a week of rain and sleet. Dry enough to catch on one match. I crouched there a long time, one hand on my knee, looking at that stack like it might explain itself if I was patient. I hadn't cut kindling that size in months, not since my wife got sick, and we started buying pre-bagged wood chunks because they were easy. My father never stacked tinder that neat. He believed in good enough. I was alone on the property, unless you counted Blue and the cows and the ghosts of old arguments. Yet there it was, practical and timely, and exactly what a tired man needed before another freeze cycle. I picked up one piece and turned it in my fingers. Fresh split. Resin smell, still bright. Not from my pile. "Thank you," I said out loud, and my own voice sounded strange in the open yard, like it belonged to somebody less stubborn. Blue came over and leaned his shoulder into my leg. I scratched the white patch at his neck and looked toward the trees again. Nothing moved out there except a branch rocking high where there wasn't much wind. The silence had softened by then. One crow called from somewhere uphill, and another answered, far off. Ordinary sounds returning by degrees. That evening I brought the phone to the porch before dark and sat on an overturned feed bucket while the sky went from pewter to ink. I opened Caleb's draft again, read the unfinished line and typed 3 words. "I'm still here." I didn't send that either. I set the phone down on my knee and watched breath fog in front of me. Behind the barn, the first edge of the next cold front pushed over the ridge like grey wool, slow and certain. I had come back to that farm thinking my life was a set of assets to liquidate and losses to absorb. Keep moving, keep it tidy, keep your head down until spring. But in one day I had muddy handprints too broad for any man I knew, and dry kindling where rain should have ruined it, and my old dog trusted whatever I could not name. The prevailing logic in my mind had cracks in it now, hairline at first, then widening. I still didn't believe in much. I still slept in my work clothes half the week and woke up reaching for someone who wasn't there. Grief was not gone. Estrangement was not fixed. The bills were not paid. Still, when I banked the stove that night, I used the dry cedar first, and the fire caught quick and clean. I stood with both hands against the warm iron and listened to the house settle in the cold. For the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt inhabited. I stayed there with my palms on the stove until the iron got too hot to touch. Then I backed away and listened to the ticking sound it made as the fire settled in. Blue had already curled on the braided rug by the sink, one eye half open like he was keeping me honest. Outside, sleet had started as a faint hiss against the porch rail, soft enough you had to choose to hear it. I put on my coat again, took the lantern from the hook, and went back out because winter on a farm doesn't care if a man has reached his emotional quota for the day. The yard had gone silver under a thin skin of ice, not enough to hold weight, enough to lie about it. The barn door still held those broad prints, darker now where damp had deepened the grain. I didn't touch them this time. I just stood there with the lantern low, looking at marks that carried more intention than plenty of people I'd known. Blue trotted ahead and paused at the calf pen, waiting for me to catch up before he moved. He did that when I was in my head too deep, as if he'd appointed himself foreman over my wandering thoughts. I checked latches, then checked them again. The smallest calf was breathing steady, tucked into straw with his nose under his flank. The two older cows shifted and blew warm fog into the cold. I ran my hand along the waterline where it entered the wall and felt no leak. Practical things. Real things. I spoke each one under my breath like tally marks. Troughs half, heaters lit, north hinge still stiff. Saying it out loud made it harder for grief to grab the wheel. When I came back into the house, I stripped wet gloves on the porch and left them over the rail to freeze into sculpture by morning. The kitchen smelled like cedar smoke and old coffee. I sat at the table with the bills spread in front of me and did what I was good at. Numbers, columns, totals with no opinions attached. Feed due Tuesday. Diesel on credit. Vet bill past grace. If I sold the 3 cows and the timber in 2 cuts, I could clear debt and still have enough to walk away with maybe 6 months of rent in town. That had been the plan I repeated until it sounded like doctrine. It still penciled out. It just didn't feel like survival anymore. It felt like surrender dressed up in bookkeeping terms. I opened Caleb's message thread again. My thumb hovered over the little arrow. I typed deleted, typed again. You don't have to come out here, I wrote. Then I erased that too. The truth in me was clumsy. I missed my son and didn't know how to admit it without sounding like I was billing him for my loneliness. After a minute, I locked the phone and set it face down. Blue got up, came over and pushed his muzzle into my thigh with the insistence of a man tapping a pencil on a desk. Yeah, I told him. I know. Send the text, save the farm, become a better person before breakfast. That made me laugh, and it sounded rough but real in the little kitchen. Sleep came in short sections that night. I'd drift off, wake to wind, drift again, wake to sleet, each time sure I'd forgotten something outside. Around 2, I gave up pretending, and sat on the edge of the bed in my long johns, listening to the house creak under cold. Grief had a habit of showing up hardest in those hours when nothing distracts you. My wife used to leave a glass of water on my side table because she said I woke thirsty when I was worried. 11 months gone, and I still reached toward where that glass would have been before my hand found empty wood. I sat there and let that hurt do what it does. I told myself I was done being a man who waited for life to happen somewhere else. But saying that in the dark and living it at sunrise are two different trades. By dawn, the sleet had thinned to mist, and a weak strip of light pushed under the curtain over the sink. I pulled on frozen gloves that cracked at the knuckles, lit the stovetop, and drank coffee standing up. Blue danced in a tight circle by the door, not frantic, just urgent. "All right," I said. "You and me versus weather again." He sneezed like he agreed. I grabbed the feed bucket, tucked my chin into my collar, and stepped into a morning so still it felt padded. No crows, no tractor noise from the neighboring ridge, no creek chatter from down by the cottonwoods, even though Thor should have had it talking. My boots made a crust-breaking sound with each step. Blue moved ahead, then slowed near the barn and looked back. Not at me exactly, more at whether I was paying attention. That posture had become familiar enough to make my skin tighten in a different way than fear. Expectant, respectful. The calf pen should have been wet. I knew that before I reached it, because last evening's straw had already started to wick damp from the concrete edge. I swung the gate and stopped with one hand on the latch. The floor inside was layered with fresh cedar boughs, thick and springy, needles bright green against the old straw. Not dropped in a pile. Laid in a bed, wider stems angled toward the draft gap on the north side, like someone had built a windbreak from the ground up. The little calf was on top of it, dry-bellied, chewing slow and sleepy. I knelt and touched the bough nearest me. Cold, but not frozen. Cut clean. Recent. Blue didn't enter right away. He stood beside me, tail level, ears forward, then turned his head toward the lower fence where the pasture sloped toward the trees. 2 deer stood there, a doe and last year's fawn, close enough I could see the dark line down the doe's nose. They were grazing, unhurried, lifting and lowering their heads in small, patient motions. Blue watched them without launching, without even the twitch he gave squirrels. He sat down, and after a second the doe looked straight at us, then went back to feeding as if we were all neighbors sharing the same morning. I stayed on one knee in the pen and tried to make a reasonable model of what I was seeing. Maybe storm wind had blown cut branches from the upper lot, except these were trimmed to length and arranged. Maybe a person had come in during the night, someone kind but odd, someone who knew my gate code and liked livestock, except there was no code, just chain and habit, and the chain had still been looped. Maybe I was missing something basic because I wanted meaning where there was only weather and chance. I had spent a year doing exactly that with hospital memories, replaying each hour looking for the one decision that might have changed the ending. Evidence suggests the mind can turn into a courtroom when grief doesn't get a verdict it can live with. Still, my hand was on a cedar branch that hadn't been here last night. The calf was warm. The pen smelled sharp and clean instead of sour damp. I stood and went straight to the woodline where we kept the old handsaws and pruning tools. Every blade I owned was where I'd left it. Dry rust on the same teeth. Handles dusted with barn grit I would have disturbed if I'd used them. At the edge of the yard, near the cottonwood blue favoured at dusk, I found prints in the softened ground. Not crisp enough for casting, not this morning, but enough for shape. Long heel, broad forefoot, stride wider than mine by half. Beside one print sat a small heap of cedar bark curls, like what falls when you strip a limb fast with a sharp edge. A workman's debris pile. Tidy, even there. Okay, I said with no one human around to hear it. I see it. Blue came over, sniffed the bark, then leaned his side against my knee, hard enough to nudge me off balance. I grabbed his collar and steadied. You trust him, don't you? I asked. Blue thumped his tail once, same as yesterday at the barn door, and looked back at the tree line with that calm, waiting expression that had started to feel like instruction. Since the handprints first appeared, I'd started checking that cottonwood before anything else each morning. The way you check a mailbox, you tell yourself, won't have news. I finished chores slower than usual because I kept noticing details that didn't fit my old assumptions. Stones by the barn threshold had been shifted into a low arc that steered meltwater away from the door seam. Not perfect engineering, just enough to keep runoff from pooling where it would freeze solid after dusk. One loose board on the far fence had been braced with a forked branch wedged at both ends, a field fix my father would have approved of. None of it flashy, all of it useful. Whoever had done it understood weather, wood, and what fails first when cold gets serious. Near noon, when the mist lifted and weak sun found the yard, I carried an apple from the kitchen out to the old stump by the pump and set it on top. I almost took it back, embarrassed by myself. Instead, I added a second apple and stepped away, wiping my hands on my jeans like I'd just completed a transaction at the feed counter. Don't make me regret getting sentimental, I muttered, and Blue gave me a look that said he'd already filed his opinion. The day wore on with ordinary tasks and unordinary company I couldn't see. I mended a hinge, hauled 2 buckets, paid 1 bill online, and ignored 3 others. By late afternoon, crows finally returned to the fence, loud and argumentative like they were catching up. When I glanced toward the stump, the apples were gone. In their place lay 3 straight pieces of split oak, dry to the core, stacked with the cut faces turned the same way. I stood there a long time with my hands in my coat pockets and the cold climbing through my boots, feeling something in my chest loosen by increments too small to measure and too real to deny. When I finally moved, I took the oak to the porch like I was carrying something fragile, set the pieces by the door, and went back to the stump to make sure I hadn't missed tracks right in front of me. The mud there held only blurred edges, and one clear heel pressed deeper than the rest, as if whoever stood there had shifted weight and paused. That pause got me, not the strength it took to split and carry wood. The pause. A person hurries when they're sneaking. An animal bolts when it feels exposed. This felt like neither. Blue nosed the stump, then sat and looked toward the cottonwoods with his ears tipped forward, patient as ever, like he'd been in on the arrangement from the start and was letting me catch up at my own speed. I did a thing my old self would have mocked and my current self didn't argue with. I fetched a yellow carpenter's pencil from the kitchen drawer, came back out, and marked a little line on the edge of the stump where the apples had sat. Then I stepped it off to the porch, counted paces, and wrote the number on the back of a feed invoice. I made notes on wood like a rookie wildlife officer with a bookkeeping addiction. Blue watched me with that long, suffering expression dogs keep for men who have wandered into nonsense with full confidence. Go ahead, I told him. Judge me. I'm one clipboard away from issuing citations to the wind. That evening, I circled the outbuildings before dark and noticed another change that looked small until you thought about weather. Along the barn threshold, the stones I'd seen shifted earlier had been settled tighter, 3 bigger rocks chocked with fist-sized wedges, so runoff would split and skirt both sides instead of driving straight into the door seam. I knelt and tested each one with my palm. Firm. Set from underneath, not dropped from above. Whoever did it understood that freezing water doesn't need much of a gap to wreck a hinge overnight. The sky had gone the colour of old steel by then, and the first breath of cold rolled down from the ridge. I stood up slower than usual, joints complaining, and felt curiosity taking up room in me where grief usually sat with its elbows out. By full dark, I had the stove going and a pot of beans warming low, and instead of staring at bills, I found myself planning experiments. Apples on the stump had come back as oak. What if I left salt blocks by the carve pen? What if I moved the shovel by the pump and checked whether it returned to the hook? The part of me trained by ledgers wanted a repeatable pattern, not a miracle. I wasn't chasing wonder so much as trying to build a framework that could hold what was happening without collapsing into wishful thinking. I wrote 2 columns on a legal pad: explanations and problems. Under explanations, I put neighbor prank, drifter, misread sign. Under problems, I filled half the page in 10 minutes. Sometime after midnight, wind pressed hard against the north wall, and I woke to Blue's low huff near the bedroom door. Not alarm. Alert. I pulled on my coat over thermal shirt and stepped onto the porch with a flashlight. Sleet stung sideways in narrow lines. The beam caught white fence wire, drifting pellets. Nothing else. Then Blue moved past me and trotted not toward the barn, but down toward the lower fence where the pasture met brush. I followed as far as the gate and listened. Between gusts, I heard one sharp metallic tick, then silence, then another tick, like wire flicking against itself under tension. I stayed there long enough to go numb in my fingers, then came in because visibility was useless, and common sense still had a vote. At first light, the storm had eased to a wet grey mist, and the lower pasture looked washed and flattened, grass laid in one direction by night wind. Blue took the lead again, straight to the creekside fence where an old line of brush and junk wire had been snagging debris for years. There, half hidden in bent sedge, I found the source of the metallic sound. A rusted snare loop anchored to a cedar root, cable frayed but still mean enough to hold. Mean enough, and now cleanly cut. The cable end was pinched flat as if clipped with heavy cutters, except I didn't own cutters that size, and the edge wasn't crushed. It was parted in one decisive bite. 10 yards beyond it, in plain view, the same doe and fawn from yesterday grazed along the slope, lifting their heads now and then, ears rotating, calm as church. I crouched by the cut cable and touched the end. Cold, slick, fresh enough that rust powder still clung loose. Blue stood beside me, tail low and easy, then looked from the deer to the tree line and back, a quiet little circuit of trust I couldn't ignore anymore. I unhooked the snare, coiled it, and carried it to the barn. I hung it on a nail in the tack room where I kept broken bits I meant to haul off. Not because I needed proof for anybody else, at least not yet, because I needed to see it in daylight later, and remember, I hadn't invented it. 3 days passed under the same thaw-freeze rhythm, each day adding one more practical correction I hadn't made myself. A forked branch brace appeared under the sagging feed shelf in the lean-to. A gap in the north fence got woven with willow switches tight enough to turn calves. The pump handle, which had been sticking halfway through its arc, moved smooth after I found the pivot pins scraped clean and reseated. None of it dramatic. All of it right on time. By the 3rd evening, I drove into town for diesel and stopped at Morrow's feed because suspicion still deserves its hearing before belief gets permanent. Nate Morrow met me at the counter with his usual pencil behind one ear, and that expression store owners wear when they know your account better than your mood. We talked grain prices first because men like us hide inside practical talk when we're testing deeper waters. Then, I set the coil of snare cable on the counter between us. "You seen anyone running lines out by my lower fence?" I asked. He turned the coil once with 2 fingers, squinted and shook his head. "Not from this side. I hear a truck at night, I know whose it is. This isn't local game warden work either." Too sloppy. Why? Found it cut clean this morning. Deer standing right there like they owned the place. Nate gave me a longer look, then leaned in on his elbows. You got trespass signs up? 2, both still standing. Gates? Latched. He nodded once, slow. Then either somebody's helping you quiet, or you've got the most useful ghost in 3 counties. I was hoping for raccoons with tool belts. He snorted a laugh, pushed the cable back toward me and said, "Whatever it is, keep your dog close and your heater fueled. Widowmaker doesn't care who cut what." That was the whole exchange, maybe a minute and a half, but it settled one piece for me. Nate wasn't humoring me. He wasn't selling a story either, just placing the fact where it belonged. Something was on my property, and it wasn't there to take. I drove home through rutted slush with diesel cans rattling in back and kept replaying the words "useful ghost," mostly because they irritated me and also because they fit better than anything I had. At the house, I topped the heater tank, checked the cows, and carried a feed bucket toward the back lot as blue hour gathered in that narrow band between day and full dark. The sky held a thin cobalt light that makes every fence line look farther away. My boots slipped twice in churned mud. Blue ranged ahead, then returned, then drifted left toward the cottonwood, and stopped with his body pointed toward the far boundary fence. I followed his line and saw at first only movement, a darker shape inside shadow where no shadow should have been. Then it stepped into the open strip beyond the fence, and every assumption I had about scale failed at once. 8 feet at least, maybe more, broad through shoulders, fur dark with wet that caught the last light in dull bands. It stood at a fallen fence post with both hands on the wood, not ripping, not jerking, just lifting in a smooth, deliberate pull that set the post upright without snapping wire. The wire sang once, high and brief, then went still. The figure held the post in place, reached down, and pressed the base deeper with one careful foot, compacting mud around it the way a man would with a tamp bar. I stopped where I was, bucket hanging from one hand, and every part of me waited for fear to arrive on schedule. It didn't. My pulse jumped, yes. My mouth went dry. But what moved through me strongest was recognition without explanation. The feeling you get when a sentence you've been trying to write for months suddenly lands in plain words. I knew, somehow, that I wasn't in danger. I could see the restraint in the way it carried itself, the space it kept, the slight angle of its torso turned so it wasn't square to me, as if even at that size it understood what direct pressure feels like to something smaller. Blue sat down at my left boot and did not bark. The figure finished at the fence post, straightened and looked our way. The distance was maybe 40 yards, enough that details blurred except for the eyes, which caught light, warm, amber brown, steady. No challenge in them, no panic either. Just attention. I set the feed bucket down slow and lifted my empty hand, palm out, because I couldn't think of any other respectful signal that made sense across species and common sense. It watched that gesture, then took one step backward from the fence and another, creating more space instead of less. That one choice told me more than any footprint had. It was accounting for me. I realized I was crying only when cold ran down from the corner of my eye and caught in my beard stubble. Not sobbing, not collapse, just a leak from someplace locked too long. "Thank you," I said, and the word came out small in the open yard. The figure dipped its head once, a short movement that could have been nothing and didn't feel like nothing, then turned sideways and moved toward the tree line. For something that large, it crossed rough ground with startling quiet, weight placed through the outside edge of each foot, branches brushing and releasing rather than breaking. At the cottonwoods it paused once, half in shadow, looked back, and then was gone into timber without drama. I stood there until the blue went to black and the cold started biting through my coat. Blue leaned into my shin, warm and solid, and I rested my hand on his neck while the cows shifted in the barn and a crow called once from somewhere uphill, late and irritated at the dark. When I finally picked up the feed bucket again, my arm felt lighter than it had in months. The fence post at the back line stood straight against the dusk, wire tight and true, holding where yesterday it had failed. I finished chores under porch light. Then, before turning in, I wrote one line on the legal pad and underlined it twice. Seen clearly at 5:42 p.m. Fixed post. Kept distance. Kind. I set the pencil down, closed the legal pad, and kept standing at the table as if the page might argue with me if I looked away. The stove gave a low, steady hum. Blue circled twice on the rug and sighed himself into sleep. I should have gone to bed. Instead, I put on my coat again, took 2 apples from the bowl, and stepped out under the porch light. The yard had that wet, cold smell of thawed mud and old hay, with sleet tucked somewhere higher on the ridge, waiting its turn. I walked to the stump by the pump, set the apples down, then hesitated and went back for a third. It felt less like bait and more like bad manners to stop at 2 after the last few days. When I turned, Blue was on the porch watching me, ears up, tail still. "I'm aware this looks foolish," I said to him. "You can put it in my permanent record." He came down the steps slow, like an old supervisor making rounds, and stood beside me while I placed the 3rd apple. I left my glove on top for a second by accident, picked it up, and laughed once at myself in the dark. I slept better than I had in months, and that was almost as unsettling as the handprints had been. No jolting awake every hour to listen for wind. No inventory of regrets at 2 in the morning. Just sleep. By dawn I was up before the alarm, coffee hot on the first pass, boots laced while the kitchen window was still black. The stump was empty when I checked it at first light. No apples, no wood this time either. Just a clean top and one long, shallow scrape in the mud beside it, like a heavy heel had pivoted there. I stood with my mug warming both hands and found I wasn't disappointed. I wasn't keeping score anymore. I was paying attention. I carried the mug back inside, set it by the sink, and went straight to the tackroom cabinet with a screwdriver and the little tin of mixed screws I kept for jobs that never made any list. The cracked latch gave me a fight, then seated true on the 3rd try. I salted the back step before the shade could glaze it. After that, I crawled under the wash basin run and rewrapped pipe insulation where the last burst had cost me half a morning, and language I won't repeat. By then, my fingers were stiff, and my knees ached through my jeans, but the line held and the heat tape light stayed on when I plugged it back. Blue shadowed me until noon, then posted himself under the cottonwood and watched the tree line while I topped off feed. Every so often, he glanced back to check if I'd noticed. I had. By late afternoon, the light flattened out, and the weather radio started muttering about another hard cycle, the kind that glazed doors shut and snapped weak limbs without warning. At blue hour, I carried the feed bucket toward the barn and saw movement near the far side of the yard, just beyond where the coop fence met the main line. Not hidden, not sudden, present. He stepped from behind a stand of young pines, in a way that let me see him whole in that dim cobalt light, shoulders broad as a gate, arms long, fur dark and rough with a damp sheen. He stopped as soon as I stopped. We stood maybe 30 yards apart with wire and open ground between us. The hens had slipped out through the side gap again, 3 of them pecking along the packed dirt near the coop corner, and he noticed them before I did. He shifted his weight, then waited, completely still, while those little half-feathered troublemakers crossed right in front of where he meant to step. One hen paused to scratch. He remained where he was until she moved on, then placed each foot with care that did not match his size. Watching that did more to settle me than any theory I'd built at the kitchen table. I told myself this couldn't be real in any ordinary way, and then I watched him tuck his arm in so he wouldn't brush a hanging coil of wire and spook the birds. Real enough. Blue walked out from beside me, not running, not crouched, just a calm, steady trot to the middle of the yard. He sat there halfway between us, looked back at me, then turned and looked at him, like a pastor introducing two stubborn men who should have spoken sooner. I had to swallow twice before I trusted my voice. "You're welcome here," I said, quiet but clear, "long as we're gentle with the stock." He tilted his head a fraction, then lowered one hand and opened it, palm out toward the ground. Empty hand. Slow movement. It was the same shape as my own gesture at the fence line days earlier, translated through a body built on another scale. No threat in it. No demand. Just acknowledgement. The crux of my disbelief had been simple. If something that large existed this close, then the world was less knowable than I'd allowed, and I had organized my grief around certainty. Certainty that loss was final, kindness rare, and survival mostly solitary. Standing there with feed dust on my sleeves, I watched him mirror caution back to me, and that whole framework started giving way. Not in a burst, in a series of quiet concessions. I took 2 steps toward the fence and set the bucket down. He took 1 step back, giving space again. I nodded once without planning to. He watched, then turned his shoulders sideways and moved towards the tree line. Halfway there, he stopped, reached down, picked up a fallen cedar limb I had failed to drag clear all week, and laid it beside the fence where I could grab it later without wading through mud. Then, he continued into shadow and was gone. Blue came back and pressed against my knee, warm and solid. I scratched behind his ear and said, "All right, I get it. I'm the last one at this meeting." Inside, I ate beans at the counter and called Nate from the wall phone, mostly because hearing another human voice helps when your worldview shifts 6 inches in one evening. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Morrows." "It's Hank. You still got bagged mineral and that fast-set post-mix?" "Got both, Storm Prep." "Yeah, and—" I stopped, then chose plain language. "Tracks again. Fresh work on my back fence. Big stride. No damage." Nate was quiet a beat. "You need me to come take a look?" I looked through the window at Blue asleep by the door, at the yard holding its own in the dark. "No. I need supplies and a little less pride. I'll be in at first light." "Copy that," he said. "I'll set 2 bags aside. Keep your heater fed. They're saying hard ice by tomorrow night." That was all. No jokes about ghosts this time. No push either. Just neighbor math. Weather plus livestock equals help if asked. Morning came with low cloud and a wet wind that smelled like metal. I drove to town, got mineral, post-mix, and a 50-pound sack of calf starter I couldn't really afford. On my way out, Nate lifted his chin toward the bags and said, "You holler if that door jams again. Widowmaker likes a dramatic entrance." "Appreciate it," I said. "And Nate?" "Yeah? If I bring you a print cast one day, you can laugh exactly once." He studied me, then shrugged. "I don't laugh at a man who keeps his animals alive." Back home, I worked until my shoulders burned. I reset the warped gate by the lower fence. I banked extra straw in the calf pen. I moved loose boards into the lean-to before wind could turn them into spears. By late afternoon, sleet started in fine diagonal lines, barely visible unless you looked toward the dark trunks beyond the pasture. I was wrestling a hay bale toward the barn when the first real gust hit, hard enough to push me a step sideways. The bale slipped, landed in slush and soaked from one end in seconds. I swore at it, hauled again, lost footing, and sat down in mud with all the grace of a dropped toolbox. Blue barked once, not alarmed, just offended on my behalf. "Don't you start," I told him, laughing and breathing hard. I got the bale upright and dragged it 2 feet before my arms gave out. That was when he came into view along the north side of the barn, moving through sleet as if weather had to work harder to matter. He didn't come straight at me. He angled wide, stopped 10 yards off, and waited. I stood, wiped my gloves on my jeans, and pointed to the lean-to where the roof dipped at one corner. "Windbreak," I said, touching my own chest, then pointing to the bales. "Need these stacked tight." He looked from me to the opening, then nodded once. One nod. He stepped in, crouched, and lifted 2 bales together with a careful grip that didn't tear twine. He carried them under cover and set them flush against the draft gap, then paused and looked back for my reaction, like a man checking he'd understood the job. I gave a thumbs up before I could feel self-conscious about it. He turned, got 2 more, and repeated the stack with cleaner corners than mine. What followed felt less like a miracle than a work crew where nobody wasted motion. I dragged. He lifted. I wedged loose planks at the base. He braced them with logs from the pile, set crosswise so wind would hit mass instead of edges. Blue ran short loops between us, then stationed himself by the calf pen, watching each placement like quality control. Sleet thickened, tapping the tin roof in fast, hard bursts. At one point, the heater vent rattled loose above the pen and started spitting warm air into the open aisle. I reached for the ladder and realized it was still behind the feed bins, blocked by frozen buckets and a bent gate panel. He had already seen it. He moved to the bins, lifted the whole stack of empty pails clear with one arm, and set them down without cracking a single one. Then he brought the ladder over, leaned it where I pointed, and stepped back. I climbed, reset the vent, and when I looked down, he was standing with one hand on the ladder rail to steady it against gusts. Eyes up, patient. That simple gesture nearly undid me. The smallest calf started coughing from the cold, a thin, anxious sound I knew too well. I dropped down, grabbed a dry blanket from the nail, and knelt in the pen. He crouched outside the rail, not entering until I opened the gate wide and nodded. Then he moved in slow, sat back on his heels several feet away, and kept still while I worked the blanket around the calf's shoulders. The calf looked up, blinked, and settled. No panic, no thrashing, just a long breath and quiet chewing. He reached one hand forward, stopped halfway, and waited for me. I put my hand over his knuckles for a second, then guided his palm to the calf's back. He touched with a gentleness I would have called delicate if it hadn't come from a hand that could have palmed a tractor tire. One slow pass along the blanket, along the calf eased down into straw and stayed there, warm between us and the heater. Outside, the sleet shifted to heavy wet snow that hissed against the yard and turned the world soft-edged. We finished the windbreak in near dark, stacking the last 2 bales and tamping them with our boots on either side of the same wall, human and not human, both of us breathing hard steam into the cold. When it held firm against the next gust, he stepped back and looked at the line, then at me. "It'll do," I said, voice rough. "You did good. Better than good." He gave that small head dip again, then turned toward the trees. At the gate he paused, reached down, and pressed his muddy palm to the barn door at shoulder height, right beside one of the older marks now faded by weather. Fresh print, deliberate. Then he moved into the white and disappeared between the cottonwoods without hurry. I stood under the lean-to, listening to the storm push and fail against what we'd built. Blue leaned into my leg so hard I had to brace on the post. I put my hand on his neck and felt his heartbeat steady through wet fur. In the barn behind us, all three cows shifted and settled, the calf breathing easy, heater running true. I stayed there until my gloves stiffened, looking at that new handprint dark on the wood, unmistakable as a signature and aimed straight at the things I loved enough to keep. I stayed there under the lean-to a few breaths longer, watching sleet skate sideways through the light and listening to the storm test every board we had just set. The new handprint on the barn door shone dark and wet beside the older faded mark, two signatures in different ages of mud. Then another gust hit, harder than the last, and practical urgency took over. I got the stock checked one more time, topped the heater fuel, and shoved 2 extra blankets into the calf pen. Blue stayed tight to my leg, not anxious, just keyed in. When I looked toward the cottonwoods, there was only blowing white and the swing of bare limbs. An hour later, the north wind found its full strength. I was in the kitchen trying to swallow reheated coffee when a crack like a rifle shot rolled across the yard, followed by a heavy slam of wood on tin. Blue was up and moving before I had my coat zipped. We hit the porch into a wall of sleet and wet snow. A cottonwood limb had come down through the outer edge of the lean-to roof. Not all the way through, but enough to peel metal back and open a gap where wind could pour straight toward the barn aisle. I ran for the door, boots slipping on a glaze that had formed in minutes, and grabbed the handle. It moved 2 inches and locked hard. Drifted ice had welded the lower seam. I put my shoulder into it once, twice, 3 times, each hit rattling my teeth and giving me nothing. Inside, the cows bawled low and restless. The little calf gave that thin cough again, then a sound I had not heard from him before, weaker and flat. I dug at the threshold with a shovel until the blade rang off packed ice. My gloves soaked through. My hands went numb. The wind drove sleet under my collar and down my back. I remember yelling without words, just noise thrown at a stuck door and weather that never negotiates. By a little after midnight, my breath came in hard bursts and my right shoulder had gone dull from impact. I stepped back for 1 second to see if I could get a running push, and through the white churn beyond the yard I saw him coming in a long, steady line, head low into the wind, arms close to his sides. He did not rush me. He came to the door, looked once at my hands on the handle, and set one massive palm flat against the warped plank near the jamb. I moved clear. He angled his shoulder under the crossbrace and leaned with controlled force, not a violent shove, more like a man easing a truck from a rut. Ice cracked along the seam. The hinge screamed. The door opened enough for me to wedge the shovel in and pull. We got it wide by degrees, both of us working the gap while sleet blew through around us. Inside, the aisle had gone white at one end where the roof tear lined up with the draft. The smallest calf was down on his side near the pen rail, legs tucked wrong, eyes half-lidded. I dropped to him and cursed myself for every minute I had spent outside fighting the wrong thing. The creature crouched beside me at a distance that left me room to move. I wrapped the blanket under the calf's chest and nodded once. He slid his hands in, broad fingers cupping belly and shoulders with a care so precise it looked practiced. He lifted that calf like warm bread, close against his chest, and stood without jostling him. "Inside stall, dry corner," I said, pointing. "By the heater." He turned exactly where I pointed and lowered the calf onto deep straw in the protected stall we had built earlier. I got the heater relit after the pilot sputtered out, hands shaking so hard it took 3 tries, and one muttered apology to machinery. He had already started reinforcing the windbreak from the inside, stacking logs at the bale base, then pressing loose hay into gaps with the sides of his hands so the airflow broke before it reached the pen. No wasted motion. No panic. Blue moved between us, then parked himself by the calf's head and licked the blanket edge once, as if confirming the patient was still in this world with us. The next hour narrowed to work and breath. I hauled feed sacks to block the lower draft. He reset the bent gate panel against the post and held it while I wired it off. I dragged the fallen limb clear of the roof edge in sections. He lifted each section away from the door path and stacked it under cover. At one point, I slipped on ice and landed hard on my knees. He stopped where he was and waited for my signal instead of reaching in and crowding me. I got up, gave a short nod, and he resumed. That restraint even then reached me deeper than the strength did. When the heater finally held a steady burn and the barn air stopped knifing straight through, I checked the calf again. His ears were warmer. Breathing had evened out. One of the cows nosed his flank and settled. I sat back on my heels in wet straw, head down, and felt the whole season hit me at once. Hospital corridors, silent dinners, the unsent text, the empty chair. Every morning I called endurance a plan. My chest tightened and then gave way. I bent forward and grabbed Blue around the neck, face in his damp fur, and cried like a man who had spent a year pretending tears were a bookkeeping error. I wasn't alone after all, I heard myself say into his collar. The words came out broken. I said them again, steadier. I wasn't alone after all. No one answered in words. Blue leaned harder against me. Heat from the stove pressed at my back. A few feet away, the creature settled into a squat by the aisle post, not leaving, not intruding, simply staying until I got my breathing back under me. I had held so much shut that I forgot release could feel physical, like a gate latch finally lifting after months of rust. Grief stayed real in that moment. It did not vanish, did not shrink into a lesson. It sat beside me, but it was no longer the only thing in the barn. When I could stand again, I wiped my face on my sleeve and got back to checks. Pipe at the wash line, intact. Trough heater cord, dry and elevated. Door hinge, strained but serviceable. He watched each point I touched, then mirrored the route once with his eyes as if committing the map to memory. The storm kept shouting outside, but it had lost ground. Our little system was holding. Bales, logs, haypack, heat. Shared labour had turned a bad night into a survivable one. By first light, the sleet thinned to a fine, icy mist, and dawn came pale behind a low cloud. The yard looked hammered flat, every fence wire silvered, every post wearing a crust. I opened the barn door to a narrow gap and checked for drift pressure. It moved, not easy, but free. That felt like victory. All 3 cows stood. The calf stayed down but alert, chewing slow with Blue stationed beside him like a volunteer nurse who refused to clock out. I turned to thank him and found him already at the far end of the aisle, near the opening where the broken roof edge had been. Morning light caught his fur in dark bronze lines. He looked larger in stillness than in motion, and older somehow, as if weather had known him longer than it had known us. He met my eyes once, amber brown and calm. I put my hand flat over my chest and dipped my head. The simplest, honest gesture I had. He returned that small head dip I had seen before, then stepped into the yard without ceremony. No dramatic pause, no backward circling. He moved past the pump, past the stump, and along the cottonwood edge where shadow still held. Blue rose as if to follow, looked at me first, and stayed when I touched his shoulder. We watched together from the threshold while the figure crossed the last strip of open ground. At the tree line he paused one final time and turned enough for that profile to catch dawn. Broad shoulder, long arm, steam from his breath, lifting white in the cold. Then he lifted one hand, palm open at his side, the same quiet sign from the yard. I raised mine in answer. He lowered it and went into the timber, branches giving and settling behind him, until there was only the ordinary pattern of trunks and drifting mist. I stood there longer than I needed to, listening to the barn breathe and the storm fade into runoff. No crows yet, no truck noise, just water starting to tick from the roof edge and the soft shift of animals alive inside a building that had made it through the night. Blue pressed into my leg. I scratched his neck and looked at the two handprints on the door, old and fresh, side by side above the latch we had fought open. And for the first time in longer than I could cleanly measure, the day ahead did not feel like a sentence. It felt like a life I intended to keep. I went back inside the barn and shut the door to the width of my shoulder, leaving just enough gap for light and air. The new print beside the latch was still damp at the edges, mud dark in the cedar grain, and I found myself reaching toward it and stopping an inch short, like touching it might turn it into a story I had made up. Blue circled once and lay by the calf again. I checked every animal one more time. Then I took the legal pad from the hook by the tack room and wrote down the night in block letters that looked steadier than my hands felt. Door jammed by ice. Opened with help. Calf warmed. All stock alive at dawn. On the shelf above the pad sat the coiled snare cable I had hung days earlier. I brought it down, unwound it on the workbench, and looked hard at the cut end in morning light. Clean split. One decisive parting. No fray pull from panic. I had told myself I'd deal with it later. Later had arrived. I walked back to the house, called the county game office when they opened, and got a tired-sounding woman named Marlene, who took notes like she had heard every kind of fence line problem there was. Location, she asked. I gave mile marker, road, and parcel number. Evidence retained? Yes, ma'am. Cut cable is in my tack room. Any active sets still on site? Not that I found. I checked line to creek twice. She paused, keys clicking in the background. Officer can swing by next route day, likely Friday. We'll log it either way. You did right removing it. That wasn't dramatic. No sirens, no special report. Just a record in a county system, and one small wrong thing less likely to happen again. It mattered to me anyway. By Thursday afternoon, the mud around the fresh handprint had dried enough to hold detail, and I decided to stop threatening Nate with a cast and actually make one. I mixed fast set in an old feed pan, cussed at the lumps, added water twice, and got a pourable slurry somewhere between pancake batter and concrete regret. Blue watched from 3 feet away with the expression of a man observing avoidable mistakes. I built a crude collar from scrap flashing, pressed it around the clearest ground print near the cottonwood, and poured slow. When it cured, I worked it loose with both hands and lifted out a pale disc, heavy as a brake rotor, ridges and toe spread plain as daylight. I set it in the tack room on 2 cedar blocks, next to the legal pad, and below, my father's bent branding iron. Evidence, yes. Also witness. That evening I drove into town for mineral and stopped at Morrow's with the cast, wrapped in a horse blanket in the truck bed. Nate came around the counter when he saw my face, not joking this time. You brought it, he said. I said I would. We stood by the tailgate while I unwrapped it. He didn't touch it at first. He leaned in, eyes narrowed, then looked over at me with the same loaded expression he had worn that first day at the register, when he almost said more than he did. My granddad used to leave apples on a stump above Red Hollow, he said quietly. Came back to stacked wood half his life. Told us kids to mind our business and keep our dogs polite at dusk. I let that sit between us. You believe me then? He gave one short nod. I believe you saw what you saw, and I believe your barn is still standing. He did laugh once, exactly once, when I told him my first mix batch set up like biscuit dough, and then he helped me load 2 more bags without another word about it. That was his way of saying enough, and not dismissing any of it. 3 days passed before Officer Red from County Wildlife rolled up in a mud-splashed truck and drank half a thermos of my coffee at the kitchen table while I showed him the snare cable. He bagged it, tagged it, and walked the lower fence with me in wet grass that soaked both our cuffs. "Likely old poacher line or somebody dumb with internet ideas," he said, crouching by the cedar root where I had found it. "You did the right thing, pulling it and calling." I considered telling him everything. The print cast, the hand on the door, the apples and oak and cedar boughs laid like care. I settled for, "There's been help out here I can't account for." He stood, looked toward the cottonwoods, then back to me. "Country's full of things we don't account for. Keep your stock close through freeze nights." He filed his report in his truck before leaving. I never heard another update, and none came. That thread stayed a county note in a database, and a nail hole empty in my tack room where the snare had hung. The harder call was Caleb. I made it at the kitchen sink with my hand on the counter, and blew underfoot, phone on speaker because my shoulder still ached from the door, and I needed both hands steady. He answered on the 4th ring with cautious silence first, then my name. "Dad?" "Yeah, it's me." I swallowed. "You got a minute?" "I do." The crux of that call wasn't whether he believed me. It was whether I could speak plain without hiding behind logistics. I told him about the storm, the jammed door, the calf making it. I told him I had been living like a man finishing paperwork on his own life. Then I said what I should have said months earlier. "I shut you out," I said. "After your mum, I shut everyone out. I'm sorry. I don't need you to agree with every word I'm saying about what happened out here. I need you to hear that I want us back." He breathed in, held it, let it go. "I've been waiting to hear that." We talked for almost an hour, not smooth, not theatrical, just honest and sometimes awkward. He told me he had started that draft text 2 months earlier and never finished because he figured I'd ignore it. I told him I had started replies and erased them like a fool. By the end, we had a date. 2nd Saturday in April, he'd drive out, and we'd repair the barn door proper before spring rains set in. By the 2nd Saturday of April, the lane had mostly dried and the foothills had gone from iron grey to that first tired green that looks fragile until you notice it keeps returning. Caleb's truck came up slow over the ruts, and he got out with my old tool belt slung over his shoulder like no time had passed, and all of it had. He looked older around the eyes than when we last worked side by side, and I knew I did too. "Door first?" he asked. "Door first," I said. We pulled warped planks, reset the lower brace, and sisted the hinge side with treated oak from the stack his grandfather had milled years ago. Mid-morning sun warmed the south wall, and swallows stitched under the eaves while we worked. When it came time to paint the patch, Caleb held the brush, looked at the 2 oversized handprints above the latch, then looked at me. "You want these covered?" I took the brush from him, set it back in the tray, and shook my head. "No, around them." He studied me for a second, then nodded once. "Around them, then." We cut in carefully, preserving both marks in a clean rectangle of old cedar surrounded by fresh red paint, deliberate as framing a photograph. At lunch, we sat on overturned buckets by the pump and ate ham sandwiches with mustard too thick, because Caleb still built them like he was feeding linemen. Blue lay with his head on Caleb's boot and sighed like a foreman pleased with staffing. Caleb asked one more time, gentle, eyes on the field. "You really saw him?" "I did." "Were you scared?" "No." I looked toward the cottonwoods. I was corrected. He let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "That sounds like you." He stayed through Sunday, helped me set the remaining post mix at the lower gate, and carried the print cast to the tack room without me asking. He ran his fingers over the edge, not the impression, and set it square on the cedar blocks like it belonged there. Before he left, he put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Call me for ordinary stuff too, not just storms." "I will," I said, and I meant it. Spring settled in, not all at once, in workable days. I kept the farm. I cancelled the timber sale and called the buyer myself, so there would be no maybe about it. I sold one older cow to clear overdue feed, kept 2 and the calf, and started rebuilding the herd slowly instead of liquidating bloodline for quick relief. Each practical choice felt like a vote cast towards staying alive inside my own life. I saw him one last time in late April at dusk, no more than 10 seconds total. Blue and I were by the cottonwood, same place he had waited through all those hard evenings. A broad shape stood at the tree line where shadow met gold light. Amber-brown eyes caught the sun. He lifted one open hand at his side. I answered. Then he stepped back into timber, branches swayed, and the woods returned to their ordinary grammar. He never came into the yard again, and I never chased him. Some gifts are not for possession. Now the cast sits in the tack room, the county report number is clipped beside my feed ledger, and the barn door still carries those prints unpainted. Nate never told the story in town, not to my knowledge. Officer Red never called back. Caleb calls on Tuesdays and shows up most months with tools I forget to return on purpose. Grief still visits. I still reach for my wife in sleep some nights and wake to an empty half of the bed. That did not get fixed by wonder, it got accompanied. What changed was the underlying story I told about being a man in this world. I had believed endurance meant isolation. Evidence proved otherwise in mud, cedar, oak, and one long night of shared labour under sleet. I wasn't alone after all. I carry that like a warm stone in a coat pocket. Not flashy, not theoretical, just there when weather turns. The world did not become smaller and safer after what I saw. It became larger and gentler, and I learned to live inside that larger frame.